The first thing I remember was the beeping. A steady, monotonous sound that grew louder as my senses crept back into focus. My eyelids felt like lead, but I managed to crack them open just enough to see the faint outlines of fluorescent lights above me. Everything felt heavy. My arms. My legs. Even my thoughts. It was like waking up from a dream where you couldn't move, except this was no dream. "Mr. Morgan? Jack?" The voice came from my left. I turned my head, though every muscle screamed in protest, and saw a nurse standing over me. Her smile was kind, but her eyes betrayed something else. Sympathy? Pity? I couldn't tell. "Welcome back," she said softly. "You've been through quite a lot." My throat felt like sandpaper. I croaked out. Where am I?" "You're in St. Mary's Hospital," she explained. "You were in a car accident. Do you remember anything?" A car accident. The words hung in the air, sparking fragmented memories. Rain on the windshield. Headlights. The blaring of a horn. And then nothing. "How long?" I managed to whisper. "You've been in a coma for 2 months," she said, her tone careful, like she was afraid the truth might shatter me. 2 months. My mind reeled. It was impossible. The last thing I remembered clearly was driving home to surprise Emily. My wife. It was our anniversary, and I had planned something special. Candles. Dinner. The works. Emily. "Where's my wife?" I asked, suddenly panicked. "Emily. Is she okay?" The nurse hesitated, just for a split second, but it was enough. "She'll be here soon," she said. "You need to rest for now." Her words didn't sit right with me. Emily should have been here. She wasn't the type to leave my side in a crisis. She'd always been fiercely protective of me, especially after our 2 kids, Lily and Ben, came into the picture. As the nurse left the room, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The thought of Emily not being there gnawed at me. What about Lily and Ben? Had anyone told them what happened? A knock at the door pulled me from my spiraling thoughts. I turned to see Mike Benson, my childhood best friend, standing awkwardly in the doorway. He looked like hell, unkempt hair, dark circles under his eyes, and a nervous energy I'd never seen in him before. "Mike," I said, forcing a smile. "Man, it's good to see you." He walked in, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Good to see you too, Jack," he said, his voice strained. "You had us all worried there for a while." I could tell something was off. Mike was usually the life of the party, the guy who could make a joke out of anything. But now he seemed tense. "How are Emily and the kids?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Mike shifted uncomfortably. "They're fine. Emily's been busy, holding down the fort." "Busy?" I frowned. "What do you mean? She hasn't been here much?" "She's been here," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just, it's been hard for everyone." There it was again. That hesitation. That guarded tone. My gut told me he wasn't being entirely honest, but I let it slide, for now. Mike sat down in the chair beside my bed, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "Jack, there's something you need to know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. "What is it?" He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get the words out, the door swung open. "Jack!" It was Emily. She rushed to my bedside, her face a mask of relief and tears. For a moment, all my doubts evaporated. This was my wife, the woman I loved, and she was here. "I was so scared," she said, grabbing my hand and squeezing it tightly. "I didn't think I'd ever see you awake again." Her words were everything I wanted to hear, but something about her didn't feel right. She was wearing a necklace I didn't recognize, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. It wasn't her usual style, and I knew I hadn't bought it for her. Still, I pushed the thought aside. I was alive, and Emily was here. That was what mattered. Mike cleared his throat, standing up abruptly. "I'll let you two catch up," he said, avoiding my gaze. We'll talk later, Jack. He left before I could respond, leaving me alone with Emily. She leaned over and kissed my forehead, her touch warm but distant. You have no idea how hard this has been, she said, her voice breaking. Tell me, I said. What happened? What have I missed? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Not now. You just woke up. Let's take it one step at a time. Her deflection only fueled my unease, but I didn't push. I was too exhausted to argue. As she held my hand and talked about how happy she was to have me back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And in the back of my mind, Mike's unfinished sentence echoed like a warning. There's something you need to know. Emily stayed by my bedside for hours that day, talking about the kids, the house, and how much she missed me. On the surface, it was exactly what I needed, my wife's voice soothing me, grounding me after 2 months in the dark. But the more she talked, the more cracks I noticed. Her tone felt rehearsed. Like she was ticking off boxes on a checklist of things she thought I wanted to hear. And every time I asked her about the accident, or what life had been like while I was unconscious, she quickly pivoted to vague reassurances. Let's not dwell on it, Jack, she said at one point, forcing a smile. What matters is you're here now. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of hushed voices just outside my room. I couldn't make out what was being said, but I recognized the cadence of an argument. Emily's voice was unmistakable, sharp and defensive. The other voice. Mike. I strained to listen. You can't keep pretending like nothing happened, Mike hissed. Keep your voice down, Emily snapped. Do you want him to find out like this? My heart raced as their voices faded down the hall. Find out what? By the time Emily returned, she seemed more composed, but I wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Mike. She acted like nothing was wrong, sitting by my bed and scrolling through her phone while I tried to piece together the fragments of the last 2 months. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Emily, I need to know, why weren't you here when I woke up? She froze for a split second before turning to me. What do you mean? I'm here now, aren't I? That's not what I asked. I kept my tone calm, but firm. You weren't here when I woke up. Why? Her cheeks flushed. I was with the kids, Jack. Someone had to keep things running at home. It was a plausible answer, but it didn't sit right. Emily was the kind of person who'd camp out in a hospital for days if someone she loved was in trouble. And now she was acting like my absence had been a minor inconvenience. Later that afternoon, the nurse from the day before came in to check my vitals. She was polite, but her gaze lingered on me, like she wanted to say something. Is everything okay? I asked. She hesitated, glancing at the door before lowering her voice. Mr. Morgan, I'm sorry if this is out of line, but you seem like a strong man. You're handling this better than most would. Handling what? I asked, confused. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. Oh, nothing. I just meant, it's a big adjustment, waking up after so long. That's all. Before I could press her further, she quickly excused herself, leaving me more unsettled than ever. That evening, Mike showed up again. I was glad to see him. It felt like he was the only person I could trust, even though he'd been acting strange too. We talked about sports, old memories, anything to avoid the elephant in the room. But eventually I brought it up. Mike, I said, cutting through the small talk. Yesterday, you said there was something I needed to know. What is it? He stiffened, his easygoing demeanor vanishing in an instant. Jack, now's not the time. Don't give me that. I leaned forward, ignoring the ache in my ribs. I've been asleep for 2 months, and no one's telling me the whole story. If you know something, you need to tell me. Now. He looked at me, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, I thought he was about to spill. But then the door opened, and Emily walked in, carrying a bag of takeout. The tension in the room was palpable. Mike avoided her gaze, muttering something about needing to run errands before making a hasty exit. Emily barely acknowledged him, setting the bag down on the table and turning to me with a bright, forced smile. I brought your favorite, she said, pulling out containers of Chinese food. I didn't have much of an appetite. The next day, things took an even stranger turn. A nurse was adjusting my floor when I overheard her talking to another staff member in the hallway. It's just sad, you know, one of them said. I know, the other replied. But it's not our place to say anything. I cleared my throat, startling the nurse in my room. She smiled nervously and quickly finished her task, leaving without another word. What were they talking about? That evening, Emily left early, claiming she needed to check on the kids. For the first time, I was alone long enough to think clearly. I tried to remember the accident, what I'd been doing that night, where I was going. The memories were hazy, but one detail came back to me like a flash: a bouquet of roses on the passenger seat. I'd picked them up for Emily. I was on my way home to surprise her. But why had I crashed? As I lay there, piecing together fragments of the night, a knock at the door broke my concentration. It wasn't Emily or Mike. It was Officer Grant, the cop who'd handled my accident. Mr. Morgan, he said, stepping inside. I wanted to check in on you. How are you feeling? Better, I said. Thanks for asking. He nodded, his expression serious. I know this might be a bad time, but there are a few details about the accident I wanted to go over with you. Do you remember anything from that night? I shook my head. Not much. Just rain, headlights, and then nothing. He nodded again, pulling out a small notebook. We've closed the case as an accident, but there were a few things that didn't add up at first. Witnesses reported seeing another vehicle in the area, a black SUV, driving erratically just before your crash. Did you have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm you? His question caught me off guard. No. I don't think so. He scribbled something in his notebook. Well, if you remember anything, give me a call. Here's my card. As he left, his words echoed in my mind. Anyone who might have wanted to harm you. I didn't have enemies. But as I thought about Emily, Mike, and all the things they weren't telling me, I couldn't help but wonder if someone close to me had secrets darker than I could imagine. When I was discharged from the hospital, I thought things would finally start to feel normal again. I was wrong. Emily picked me up that morning, the kids in the back seat of the car. Lily, our 10-year-old, gave me a hesitant hug when I got in, but Ben, who was only 7, didn't say much. His face was buried in his tablet. Hey, buddy, I said, ruffling his hair. He barely looked up. Emily brushed it off. He's just shy. He's been through a lot. We all had, but it still stung. When we pulled into the driveway, I stared at our house. It looked the same as before the accident: white siding, blue shutters, the porch swing I'd installed last summer. But stepping inside felt like walking into a stranger's home. The living room had been rearranged. Furniture was swapped out, new curtains hung where the old ones used to be. There were fresh pictures on the mantel, but some were missing, ones of me and Emily, ones of our family. Why does everything look different? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Emily smiled awkwardly. I had to make a few changes. It felt empty without you here. It didn't feel like my home anymore. The kids ran off to their rooms while Emily helped me settle in. She was overly attentive, fluffing pillows and asking if I needed water. It felt like a performance. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed the silence. Emily was sleeping in the guest room. To give me space to recover. I didn't push back. It wasn't like we'd been close before the accident. But it still felt wrong. The next day, Lily let something slip. Mommy's friend came over a lot when you were gone, she said while I helped her with her math homework. I froze. What friend? She shrugged. Ryan. He brought us ice cream once. Ryan. The name felt like a sharp jab in my gut, but I kept my voice steady. What else did he do? She frowned, her pencil hovering over her workbook. I don't know. He stayed late sometimes. Mommy said he was helping her. Helping her? Helping her with what? That night, I brought it up to Emily. Who's Ryan? I asked casually, watching her reaction. Her hand froze halfway to the plate she was setting down. Ryan? Lily mentioned him. Said he came over while I was gone. Her face tightened. He's just a friend from the gym. He helped with a few things around the house. That's all. I didn't believe her, but I didn't push. Not yet. Over the next few days, I started noticing other changes. The clothes in the laundry weren't all ours. There were men's workout shirts and a hoodie I didn't recognize. Emily said they belonged to Ben's friend's dad, who had left them behind after a play date. It was a flimsy excuse. Then there were the neighbors. People I'd known for years gave me strained smiles and avoided eye contact. A few even crossed the street when they saw me coming. Something had shifted, and I was the only one who didn't know why. One afternoon, I asked Emily about my phone. It was destroyed in the accident, she said too quickly. I got you a new one, but I haven't set it up yet. I asked for it anyway, but when she handed it to me, it wasn't new. It was old, scratched, and barely functional. The call logs and messages had been wiped. I decided to test her. I need to call the insurance company about the car, I said. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a split second, I saw panic. I already handled it, she said. Don't worry about it. I smiled, pretending to accept her answer. That night, while she was putting the kids to bed, I'd borrowed her laptop and looked up the insurance company's number. When I called, the representative said something that sent a chill down my spine. We already spoke to Mrs. Morgan about the accident. She told us you were driving home late from an event. An event? That wasn't true. I was coming home from work, heading straight to Emily for our anniversary surprise. Why would she lie? The next day, I started digging. I called my coworker, Kyle, who confirmed what I already knew. I'd left the office early to pick up flowers and get home for the anniversary dinner I'd planned. I decided to ask Emily directly, but she deflected as usual. Why does it matter? She snapped. The important thing is that you're okay. Can't we just move on? No, Emily, I said firmly. We can't. Her face darkened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I couldn't ignore: fear. That evening, Mike came over again. He looked more stressed than the last time, glancing over his shoulder like someone was following him. We need to talk, he said as soon as Emily left to pick up groceries. I nodded. Then talk. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the living room. Jack, there's stuff you don't know. Things that happened while you were in the hospital. I folded my arms, waiting. Like what? He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right words. Finally, he said, It's about Emily. The room felt colder. What about her? She wasn't herself while you were out, he said, avoiding my gaze. The sound of the garage door opening cut him off. Emily was home. Mike's face twisted in frustration. I'll tell you everything later, he whispered before bolting out the back door. That night I couldn't sleep. Mike's words haunted me. What had Emily done while I was gone? And why was everyone acting like I didn't deserve to know? The next morning, while Emily was taking the kids to school, I searched her bedroom. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. I found a shoebox tucked away in the back of her closet. Inside were old photos, letters, and receipts. Most of it seemed harmless until I came across a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a gym membership card. It was a bar tab, 2 months old, dated just a few weeks after my accident. The name on the receipt wasn't Emily's. It was Ryan Harper's. As I stared at the receipt, a dark thought crossed my mind. Emily had lied about where she was, about what she'd been doing. If she was lying about this, what else had she been hiding? I was going to find out. The bar receipt stayed with me, a quiet accusation in my pocket as the days passed. I couldn't look at Emily the same way anymore. Every smile, every kind gesture felt like a carefully rehearsed act. The doubts were eating me alive. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from her. That morning, I decided to visit the police station. The officer who had handled my accident, Officer Grant, had left his card with me, and I figured he might have more details. When I arrived, Grant greeted me with a firm handshake. "Mr. Morgan, good to see you up and about. What can I do for you?" I hesitated for a moment before diving in. "I can't shake the feeling that there's more to my accident than I've been told. Is there anything in the report that doesn't make sense?" He scratched his head. "Well, as I mentioned before, witnesses reported seeing a black SUV near the scene, driving erratically. We couldn't track it down, though. And then there's your wife." My stomach tightened. "What about Emily?" Grant glanced around, lowering his voice. "She didn't come to the hospital right away. When she did show up, she seemed preoccupied. Distracted. It stood out to me, considering the circumstances. Preoccupied. Distracted. What could possibly have been more important than her husband being in a coma? Did she say why?" I asked. Grant shook his head. "No, but I had the impression she wasn't being entirely honest. You might want to ask her yourself." That evening, I sat Emily down. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She was in the middle of folding laundry and barely looked up. "About what?" "About the night of my accident. Why didn't you come to the hospital right away?" Her hands stilled, and she glanced at me with wide eyes. I was home with the kids. I couldn't just leave them." It was an excuse I'd heard before, but now it sounded hollow. "They could have stayed with Mike," I pressed. "Or a neighbor. You weren't there for hours, Emily." "Why?" She sighed, her face hardening. "Do you have any idea how hard this has been for me? Keeping the kids' lives together, paying the bills, dealing with—" "That's not an answer," I interrupted. Her jaw clenched, and she grabbed the laundry basket. "I don't need to explain myself to you, Jack." She stormed off, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Her defensiveness only confirmed what I already suspected: she was hiding something. The next day, I decided to talk to my neighbors. If anyone had seen or heard anything unusual while I was in the hospital, it would be them. I started with the Johnsons next door. Mrs. Johnson, a friendly woman in her 60s, was eager to chat. "Oh, Jack, we were all so worried about you," she said, clutching my hand. "You gave us quite the scare." "Thanks," I said, managing a weak smile. "Listen, I was wondering, did anything strange happen while I was in the hospital? Any visitors at the house?" Her smile faltered. "Well, there were a few people coming and going. I assumed they were friends helping out, but—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" I prompted. "Well, there was this one man," she said, lowering her voice. "He came over a lot. Tall, muscular, always wore gym clothes. I think his name was Ryan." There it was again. Ryan. "What did you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, then sighed. "I don't want to cause trouble, Jack, but I saw them together a few times. Late at night. They were close." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. That night, I confronted Emily again. "Who is Ryan Harper?" I asked bluntly. Her face paled, but she recovered quickly. "I already told you, he's a friend from the gym. Why are you suddenly so paranoid?" "Because everyone keeps mentioning him," I shot back. "Lily. The neighbors. Even the bar receipt I found with his name on it." Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "You went through my things? That's not the point, and you know it," I snapped. "I want the truth, Emily. Were you seeing him while I was in the hospital?" She stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line, before finally saying, "You're being ridiculous. I was under so much stress, Jack. I needed someone to talk to, someone to help out. That's all it was." "Then why does everyone describe it differently?" I asked, my voice rising. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house. The next morning, Mike called. "Jack, we need to meet," he said, his voice urgent. "Why?" What's going on? It's about Emily. There's something you don't know. An hour later, we met at a diner across town. Mike looked worse than ever, his hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. Just say it, I urged. He took a deep breath. Emily's been cheating on you. With Ryan. The words were like a physical blow. Even though I'd suspected it, hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. How long? I asked, my voice hollow. Since before the accident, he admitted. But it got worse after. She didn't think you'd wake up, Jack. The room felt like it was spinning. She told me she felt trapped. Mike continued. She said she loved Ryan and was planning to leave you. The only reason she didn't is because you woke up. I couldn't breathe. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me. And it wasn't just the affair. It was the lies, the coldness, the way she'd acted like I was a burden instead of her husband. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike looked ashamed. I didn't know how. I thought maybe she'd come clean on her own. But when I saw the way she was treating you, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I replayed everything in my mind. Emily's excuses. Her distance. The looks from the neighbors. It all made sense now, and it was worse than I could have imagined. I wasn't just recovering from a car accident. I was recovering from a betrayal that had been happening right under my nose. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sure. Here's the rewritten section without dialogue, focusing entirely on the events and emotions through narration. Jack confronted Emily that evening with a calm intensity that masked the storm raging inside him. He pieced together enough fragments to demand answers, and his patience for her evasions had run out. As he brought up Ryan Harper's name, he watched her closely. The subtle pause, the flicker of surprise in her eyes, it was all the confirmation he needed. Emily hesitated before responding, her movements deliberately slow as if buying herself time. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a forced confidence that didn't quite match the unease in her body language. She tried to deflect, using the same tired excuses she'd leaned on before. Jack felt the weight of her words, not because they held truth, but because of what they revealed, her unwillingness to own up to her betrayal. As she spoke, Jack's focus sharpened, dissecting every word, every gesture. Her explanation twisted the narrative, framing her actions as a response to the challenges she'd faced during his coma. She painted herself as the victim of circumstance, as if her choices were an inevitable result of Jack's absence. But he wasn't buying it, not anymore. The tension between them grew unbearable. Emily's voice grew harder, her mask slipping to reveal a coldness Jack hadn't seen before. She tried to turn the blame back on him, dredging up old grievances, accusing him of not being present enough before the accident. But Jack saw through it. This wasn't about the past. It was about the lies she was telling right now. When he pressed her further, her composure finally cracked. She stopped pretending to justify her actions and lashed out, her words cutting and defensive. Jack felt the sting, but it only steeled his resolve. She wasn't going to give him the truth willingly. He'd have to dig deeper to uncover it himself. As Emily stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Jack sat alone in the silence she left behind. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on him, but beneath it was a burning determination. He didn't just want to know the truth, he needed it. And no matter what it took, he was going to find it. This version focuses on the unspoken tension and internal reactions, making the confrontation more about Jack's observations and Emily's unraveling facade. I left the gym after my confrontation with Ryan, my mind spinning with what he'd just revealed. Emily had been with him the night of the accident. She was there, in her car, arguing with her lover while I was on my way home to surprise her. And now I knew the truth. Or at least part of it. When I got home, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. The sight of her, so calm, so composed, made my stomach turn. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had everything I needed. Instead, I kept playing my part, acting like I was still piecing things together, like I didn't already know she'd been with Ryan that night. If she was going to lie, I'd let her. But every word she spoke, every move she made, only added to the growing file in my head. That night, I reviewed the footage from the hidden cameras again, this time with fresh eyes. I wasn't just looking for proof of the affair anymore. I was looking for anything that might explain what Ryan had meant by the plan. It didn't take long to find it. 2 nights earlier, while I was asleep, Emily and Ryan had met in our living room. She'd let him in through the back door, their voices low but tense. "Jack's starting to ask questions," Emily said, her arms crossed. "So what?" Ryan shot back. "It's not like he can prove anything." Emily shook her head. "You don't get it. He's not stupid. If he keeps digging, he'll figure it out." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "Maybe we should just tell him. Get it over with." "Are you insane?" Emily hissed. "Do you know what he'd do if he found out about us?" "About the money?" "The money." My blood ran cold. "What about the plan?" Ryan asked, stopping in his tracks. Emily glared at him. "We stick to it. He doesn't know everything yet. As long as we keep our stories straight, we'll be fine." I played the clip over and over, trying to decipher their cryptic conversation. What plan? What money? I thought back to the accident, to the questions Officer Grant had asked me. Was it possible Emily and Ryan had something to do with it? The idea seemed insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The black SUV witnesses had seen Emily's coldness, the way she'd avoided coming to the hospital. It all pointed to one chilling possibility: the accident wasn't an accident. The next day, I went back to the police station. Officer Grant looked surprised to see me. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "what brings you back?" I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out my phone and played the clip from the hidden camera. Grant's expression darkened as he listened. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I installed cameras in my house," I admitted. "I had a feeling something wasn't right." He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "This changes things. If they were talking about the accident—" "I think they were," I interrupted. "Ryan admitted to me that he was with Emily that night. He said they were arguing in her car. If they caused the crash—" Grant nodded grimly. "I'll need to open an investigation. This could be bigger than just an affair, Mr. Morgan. If there's any evidence they tampered with your car or were negligent in some way, we're looking at criminal charges." That evening, I called Dan, my lawyer, and told him everything. "You need to be careful, Jack," he warned. "If what you're saying is true, Emily might start to panic. And people do stupid things when they feel cornered." I knew he was right. Emily wasn't going to go down without a fight. The next morning, I pretended to leave for a physical therapy appointment but instead parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, within an hour, Ryan's black SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched from my car as Emily let him in, their conversation muffled but heated. I couldn't make out the words, but their body language said it all. Emily was gesturing wildly, while Ryan stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. I hit record on my phone, capturing everything I could from the outside. It wasn't much, but every piece of evidence mattered now. When Emily came back inside that evening, she was unusually quiet. I could tell she was on edge, her eyes darting around like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She didn't have to wait long. "Where were you today?" I asked casually over dinner. She froze, her fork hovering in midair. "I went to the store." "Why?" "No reason," I said, forcing a smile. "Just curious." Her lie hung in the air, a thin veil over the truth I already knew. That night I made my move. While Emily was sleeping, I sent everything I had, emails, camera footage, and the recording from my car, to Officer Grant and Dan. I wasn't going to give her a chance to manipulate the narrative. The next morning, as Emily sipped her coffee, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Officer Grant and 2 other officers standing on the porch. "Mr. Morgan," Grant said. Is your wife home? I nodded, stepping aside. She's in the kitchen. Emily's face went pale as the officers entered. Mrs. Morgan, Grant said, his tone professional but firm. We need to ask you a few questions about the night of your husband's accident. Emily turned to me, her eyes wide with fury and betrayal. What did you do? She hissed. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching as the life she'd so carefully constructed began to crumble around her. Emily's fury was like a live wire, sparking and unpredictable. She turned on me as the officers waited, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. What did you tell them, Jack? Her words were sharp, but I could see the fear behind her eyes. She wasn't angry because I'd involved the police. She was terrified. Officer Grant cut in before I could respond. Mrs. Morgan, we need you to come with us to the station for questioning. It's about the accident. Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, she spat. I need to call my lawyer. You can do that at the station, Grant said firmly. The officers escorted her out, leaving the house eerily silent. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of control. Emily was finally facing the consequences of everything she'd done. I spent the rest of the day replaying the events in my mind. Watching her leave in handcuffs had been satisfying, but it also left me with a bitter taste. This wasn't how our story was supposed to end. As I sifted through the recordings one more time, something caught my attention. A detail I'd overlooked in the chaos. In one of the earlier clips, Emily had been on the phone with someone, her voice hushed, her tone panicked. I told you, we have to wait. It's too risky right now. The voice on the other end was faint, but it was unmistakably Ryan. We can't wait forever, he'd replied. If he finds out about the account, we're screwed. The account. My heart raced as I rewound the clip, listening again. What account? The next morning, I called Dan and told him what I'd found. He suggested we dig into our finances, something I hadn't thought to do before. It didn't take long to find the discrepancies. Emily had opened a separate bank account 6 months before the accident. At first, the deposits were small, but they grew larger over time. And then there was the most recent deposit, $250,000. Where the hell did that money come from? I asked Dan, my voice tight with anger. He sighed. It could be anything, Jack. A payout, a loan, or insurance. The word hit me like a freight train. Insurance. I called Officer Grant immediately, telling him about the account. He promised to look into it, and suggested I come down to the station to make a formal statement. When I arrived, I saw Emily sitting in one of the interrogation rooms. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, regret maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Grant met me in the lobby, his expression serious. Jack, there's something you need to hear. He led me to another room where Ryan was sitting, his head in his hands. He's agreed to talk, Grant said. Ryan's confession was a whirlwind of guilt and excuses. He admitted to the affair, to being with Emily the night of the accident, and to knowing about the account. But what he said next changed everything. She said it was the only way, Ryan muttered, avoiding my gaze. We weren't trying to hurt you, man. She said she couldn't leave without the money. What money? I demanded, my voice shaking. Ryan swallowed hard. The life insurance. She said she'd cash it out and we'd start fresh. I didn't know she'd. I didn't think it would go this far. The room spun. Emily had been planning to use my death, as a ticket to a new life with Ryan. When Grant came back with the details, the pieces finally clicked. Emily had taken out a new life insurance policy on me just 3 months before the accident. The payout? A cool $1 million. Grant's team found evidence that the brakes on my car had been tampered with. They suspected Emily and Ryan had staged the accident, but something had gone wrong. Instead of killing me, the crash had put me in a coma. And now, with me awake and asking questions, their entire plan had fallen apart. That evening, as I sat in the quiet house, the weight of everything hit me. Emily hadn't just betrayed me, she'd tried to kill me. The love I'd once felt for her was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. But there was one thing I knew for certain. This wasn't over yet. Emily and Ryan's plan unraveled faster than I could have imagined. The police found damning evidence on Emily's laptop, emails detailing the insurance policy and messages between her and Ryan discussing how they'd make it look like an accident. Emily was arrested that same night. The news should have brought closure, but instead, it cracked open a new layer of dread. How long had she been planning this? Was I just a pawn in her game from the start? The next morning, I sat down with Officer Grant and my lawyer, Dan, to go over the case. "We have enough to press charges," Grant said. "Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and endangerment. If she's convicted, she'll face decades in prison." "And Ryan?" I asked. "He's cooperating," Grant replied. "He's trying to pin most of it on her, but he's not getting off easy. He knew about the plan and went along with it. That makes him an accomplice." It was satisfying to know they'd both face justice, but it didn't erase what they'd done. As I left the station, I saw Emily being led out in handcuffs. She spotted me, her eyes blazing with fury and desperation. "This isn't over, Jack!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the hallway. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Over the next few weeks, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. My lawyer helped me secure custody of the kids, and I started the process of selling the house. There were too many memories in those walls, too much betrayal embedded in its foundation. But Emily's words haunted me. "This isn't over." I should have brushed it off as an empty threat, but something about the way she said it chilled me. One night, as I was going through boxes in the garage, I found a folder tucked away in a corner. It was filled with old documents, car titles, insurance policies, and financial records. Among them was a letter from Emily. It was dated a year before the accident, and its contents stopped me cold. "Dear Jack, I've been thinking about us lately, about where we're headed. I don't know if I can keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. You're distant, and I feel like I'm suffocating in this life we've built. Maybe it's my fault for not saying anything sooner, but I can't do this much longer." The letter wasn't signed, and it didn't explicitly mention leaving me. But it was clear Emily had been planning her escape long before the accident. I wondered if this was her way of testing the waters, seeing if she could justify what she was about to do. As the trial date approached, Emily's lawyer reached out with a plea deal. She was willing to admit to fraud and conspiracy if they dropped the attempted murder charge. I wanted to reject it outright, but Dan advised me to consider it. "She's going to prison either way," he said. "But this will save you from having to testify in court." The thought of standing in front of a jury, recounting every painful detail, was almost too much to bear. In the end, I agreed to the deal. Emily pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud, and the judge sentenced her to 15 years. Ryan, who turned state's witness, got 10. For a while, it seemed like things might finally settle down. I focused on my kids, on healing, on trying to rediscover the parts of myself I'd lost in the chaos. But then came the letter. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, slipped into my mailbox without a return address. The handwriting was Emily's, sharp, slanted, and unmistakable. "Jack, you think this is over, but it's not. You took everything from me, my freedom, my future. You'll pay for this. You'll see." I stared at the letter for a long time, my mind racing. Was it just an empty threat? A desperate attempt to cling to control? Or was there something more? I gave the letter to Grant, who assured me Emily couldn't act on her threats from prison. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done with me yet. One night, as I was tucking the kids into bed, Lily looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, "is Mommy coming back?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Not for a long time, sweetheart." Her brow furrowed. "She said she'd come back for us." My heart stopped. "When did she say that?" "Before she left," Lily said. "She told me not to tell you, but she said she'd make everything better. The weight of her words pressed down on me like a lead blanket. Emily might have been behind bars, but her shadow still loomed over my life. And I knew, deep down, that she wasn't finished with me yet. After Lily's chilling admission, I felt a renewed sense of unease. Emily's threats weren't just empty words, they had weight behind them. Despite being locked away, she had managed to plant a seed of fear in my daughter's mind. And if she could do that, what else was she capable of? I tightened the security around the house, new locks, cameras on every entrance, and motion sensor lights in the backyard. The police assured me that Emily's ability to act from prison was limited, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A week later, I noticed something strange. A black SUV parked at the end of my street, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It wasn't a neighbor's car, and it hadn't been there before. At first, I brushed it off as a coincidence. Maybe someone visiting a friend. But the next day, it was there again. And the day after that. I decided to confront it. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight, I walked down the street, my heart pounding. As I approached, the SUV's engine roared to life, and it sped off before I could get close. The next morning, I called Officer Grant. "Have you noticed anything else unusual?" he asked after I told him about the SUV. "Just that," I said. "But it's enough to make me nervous." Grant sighed. "I'll look into it, but unless they're actively threatening you, there's not much we can do. Keep your cameras rolling, and let me know if anything changes." It wasn't the reassurance I was hoping for, but I appreciated his honesty. That afternoon, as I was sorting through the mail, I found another letter. This one was different, typed, with no handwriting to identify the sender. "You think you're safe, but you're not. She's not the only one who wants revenge. Watch your back." My hands trembled as I read it over and over. She's not the only one. What did that mean? Was Ryan involved? Someone else? I took the letter to the police, but without a return address or fingerprints. It was just another ominous warning. Days passed without incident, and I started to let my guard down. The black SUV didn't return, and no more letters appeared in my mailbox. Then one night the phone rang. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. No one called that late unless it was an emergency. "Hello?" I answered, my voice tight with apprehension. There was silence on the other end. "Who is this?" I demanded. A click, and then the line went dead. The next morning, I checked the call logs on my phone. The number was blocked. Frustrated, I went through the recordings from my security cameras, but nothing seemed out of place. That was until I checked the footage from the front porch. At 11:30 p.m., just minutes before the call, the camera caught a figure standing at the edge of my driveway. The image was grainy in the low light, but it was clear enough to see someone lingering there for several minutes before walking away. I showed the footage to Officer Grant, who agreed to step up patrols in the neighborhood. "This could just be someone trying to intimidate you," he said. "But we'll take it seriously." Intimidate me? It was working. A few nights later, the unthinkable happened. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. Heart racing, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept toward the source of the noise. It was coming from the kitchen. As I turned the corner, I saw a shadowy figure climbing through the broken window. They were dressed in black, their face obscured by a mask. "Hey!" I shouted, raising the bat. The intruder froze for a split second before bolting back out the window. By the time I reached it, they were gone. The police arrived within minutes, but the intruder had vanished. They found footprints in the flower bed outside the window and a crowbar they dropped in their haste to escape. "It doesn't look like they took anything," one of the officers said. "Probably just wanted to scare you." Scare me? If that was the goal, they'd succeeded. The next morning, I received another letter. "You're not as smart as you think you are. This isn't over." I stared at the words, my stomach churning. Emily might have been behind bars, but her influence clearly wasn't. I was starting to wonder if I'd ever truly be free of her. That evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, I found myself wondering how much of this they understood. Lily and Ben had been quiet lately, their smiles forced. "Daddy," Ben said as I turned out the light, "is someone trying to hurt us?" The question cut me to the core. "No, buddy," I said, forcing a reassuring smile. "We're safe. I promise." But as I left their room, I couldn't help but feel like I was lying. The house was silent, but my thoughts were deafening. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through me. The letters, the break-in, the calls, it all felt like a ticking time bomb. And then, it exploded. It was a Friday night, just after the kids had gone to bed. I was in the living room reviewing footage from the security cameras again, desperate for answers. That's when the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and a heavy silence settled around me. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I moved to the kitchen, where the breaker box was located, but as I opened the panel, I saw something that stopped me cold. The main switch had been flipped off. Someone was in the house. I spun around, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The faint sound of footsteps came from the hallway. I moved cautiously toward them, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. As I turned the corner, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. They were dressed in black, their face obscured by a ski mask. "Get out of my house!" I shouted, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The figure didn't move. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a tense standoff. Then they turned and bolted toward the back door. I gave chase, adrenaline fueling my steps. But by the time I reached the door, they were gone, disappearing into the night. The police arrived minutes later, but the intruder had left no trace. "This is escalating," Officer Grant said grimly as he examined the broken lock on the back door. "Do you recognize anyone who would go this far?" My first thought was Emily. Even behind bars, she'd managed to orchestrate chaos in my life. But was she capable of this? Grant promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood, but his reassurances felt hollow. The threat was becoming too real. The next day, I received a call from the prison where Emily was being held. "Mr. Morgan," the warden said, "we thought you should know, Emily Morgan was transferred to the infirmary last night after being attacked by another inmate." My grip tightened on the phone. "Is she okay?" "She's stable," the warden replied. "But we found something concerning in her cell, a list of addresses, including yours." The discovery sent a fresh wave of dread through me. If Emily had been working with someone outside the prison, they had access to everything. My address, my routine, my kids. I called Dan, my lawyer, and told him everything. "This is beyond a divorce case now, Jack," he said. "You need to protect yourself and the kids. I'll help you file for a restraining order against anyone connected to her." But would a piece of paper stop someone this determined? That night I barely slept. Every sound outside the house felt like a threat, every shadow a potential attacker. At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the security cameras. Someone was at the front door. I pulled up the live feed, expecting to see the masked intruder again. But what I saw chilled me to the core. It was Mike. I opened the door cautiously, finding him standing there, drenched in sweat. "Mike?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" He pushed past me, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Jack, you need to listen to me. This whole thing, Emily, the break-ins, it's worse than you think." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, closing the door behind him. I didn't know how to tell you before," he stammered. "But I was involved. She roped me into it." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, involved?" "Emily asked me to help her with the insurance scheme," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know she was planning to kill you. I thought it was just about the money. But when you survived the accident, everything spiraled out of control." I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. "You knew? You knew this whole time, and you didn't tell me?" "I was scared," he shouted. She said if I told you she'd ruin me. I didn't think she'd actually go through with it. You were my best friend, I said, my voice breaking. How could you do this to me? Mike's confession was the final blow. It wasn't just Emily who had betrayed me, it was the person I trusted most outside of my family. I'm going to the police, I said, grabbing my phone. Jack, wait. No! I snapped. You don't get to ask me for anything. You're as guilty as she is. The next morning, I met with Officer Grant and handed over everything, Mike's confession, the letters, the footage, all of it. With Mike's cooperation, the police uncovered the full extent of Emily's plan. She'd manipulated everyone around her, using lies and threats to cover her tracks. But she hadn't counted on one thing, me surviving. Emily was hit with additional charges, and Mike, now fully cooperating with the investigation, faced charges of his own. As the case closed, I finally felt a sense of relief. Emily and Ryan were behind bars. Mike was out of my life. But the scars remained. Months later, as I watched Lily and Ben play in the backyard, I realized how much I'd lost, and how much I still had. My kids were my anchor, the reason I kept going when everything else had fallen apart. I vowed to rebuild, not just for myself, but for them. Because in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't justice or punishment. It was living. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.